watching the World News here on Press TV. We're coming to you live from our headquarters in Tehran. Many thanks for joining us this hour. The Syrian Foreign Ministry says that Damascus is committed to its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention it joined in 2013 following a suspected chemical attack in Idlib. The Foreign Ministry denied allegations that the Syrian army had carried out any such attack against civilians. Back in 2014, Syria handed in the last batch of its chemical weapons to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons for destruction. The Russian Defense Ministry has also reacted by saying its planes have not conducted any airstrikes in the town of Khan Sheikhun in Idlib. The comments were made after the so-called Syrian Observatory for Human Rights blamed the attack on Syrian forces and their Russian allies. The EU Foreign Policy Chief and the UN Syria envoy have also commented on the attack at a joint press conference.
Chemical weapons as the worst of the war crimes, and whoever is responsible for that must be held accountable.
And we have been asking, and the UN is going to ask, and I'm sure there will be also at the Security Council a meeting on this, for clear identification of responsibilities and accountability. It's true. Every time we have a moment in which the international community is capable of being together, 70 countries tomorrow, there is someone, somehow, that tries to undermine that feeling of hope by producing a feeling of horror and outrage. But we are not going to give up.
White House directly blames the Syrian government for the attack prior to any investigation. It has also held the previous U.S. administration responsible for failing to establish a red line against the use of chemical weapons. The UN Security Council will hold an emergency meeting on Wednesday to discuss the incident. According to an aid group, the suspected chemical attack on the militant-held town of Khan Sheikhun has killed at least 100 people, including many children. Some 400 people are said to have been wounded. The Damascus government has repeatedly blamed the terrorists for such attacks, including one in northern Aleppo last year. Joining us now via Skype from Bristol is Tony Gosling. He's an investigative journalist. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Gosling. Now, ever since the onset of this news, we're getting the mainstream media very quick to point fingers at the Bashar al-Assad government, even the Russians. What do you make of it?
Well, if you remember the Ghouta chemical weapons attack in 2013, it took the United Nations, Carla Del Ponte, American investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, with his top-level intelligence contacts, best part of a year to come to the full conclusion with the evidence that it was the rebels that had conducted that attack, not the Syrian regime. So today, we're not talking about a year's investigation, we're talking about a couple of hours. The mainstream media is a rush to judgment here, pointing the finger immediately at the Assad government. It looks more to me like propaganda than real news. The most important reason here, which none of the journalists here in the television and radio here in Britain have pointed out, is that the President Assad has got absolutely no reason whatever to use weapons of mass destruction in his own country, because he's winning against ISIS. These are the sorts of weapons that are the weapons of desperation, far more likely to be used by ISIS. Also, I noticed Russia Today reporting that it looks as if it may well have been an ISIS chemical weapons factory that was hit by the air. Could have been various people, and it could even have been a ground-to-ground attack that hit an ISIS chemical weapons factory. But none of this, of course, being reported in the West, which is why it looks to me as if they're just trying to use this as an excuse, without evidence, to blame Assad again.
Right now, Mr. Gosling, how important is it for the media to ask the questions that are necessary in order to give viewers a clearer picture of what went down there in Idlib?
Well, of course, it's absolutely crucial that journalists ask questions, and we're not seeing that here. The basic, obvious questions are simply not being asked. I mean, for example, civilians dying here, were they civilians that were being used as human shields? Because we've seen ISIS doing this time and time again. And yet that basic, obvious question that many people will be looking at this, you know, especially after what's been going on in Mosul and what's happened in Aleppo, will be saying, you know, are these civilian deaths actually being deliberately encouraged by ISIS, and then the attempt being to blame the other side? Also, very important that some of the networks, I noticed Russia Today, quite rightly saying at the moment we cannot confirm this footage is genuine and accurate from today and from the scene. None of the Western press have been doing this either. So I'm afraid the conclusion is that this is just simply another attempt, like the 2013 attempt, to smear the Assad government and, as we heard before, to poison the possibility of peace, because the West is committed to regime change in Syria. And even though the military have told many of the politicians and power brokers that it's not going to be possible because they don't want to have a war with Russia, now Russia's backing Assad, it looks like the media are the last people to realise this, and they're simply not asking the questions that should be being asked, particularly the rush to judgment. Like I say, it smacks to me immediately of just propaganda. How can they know? How do they have the evidence? They don't. It clearly don't within just a few hours.
Right now, Mr. Gosling, I'd like to pick up on this point that you just made a bit earlier. And I'd like to get your opinion as far as the timing of all this goes. It's coming right after the U.S. had announced its intention to focus more on Daesh and no longer go after regime change in Syria. Do you think that the way this is being covered is now going to force the U.S. government's hand into taking a step back as far as that policy change went?
Yes, I mean, it may just simply be a reaction, almost a knee-jerk reaction to changes in US policy. But look, at the end of the day, the Syrians have said they are adhering and they intend to continue to adhere to the international rule of law. I'm afraid that Israel and the NATO countries have simply not been doing that. I mean, we've seen the United Nations again condemning Israel for settlements. So the international rule of law is there for a reason, and it's to keep the peace. I think, afraid that there are some people out there, some of whom make a lot of money out of war, that don't want to keep the peace, and they also don't want to reflect on the possibility that it may be some of the people within their own countries that are behind these horrendous acts and effectively a kind of smear campaign against the Assad government. There even seems to be attempts to ramp up tensions with Russia because they know Russia is protecting Assad. We've seen literally today troops being brought from Britain over right up to the Russian border. I mean, we've seen since the Cold War countries being encouraged to join NATO, the move of NATO east and east right up to the Russian border. And now that fairly peaceful thing is over. Now it looks as if Britain and the United States are moving troops right up to the Russian border. And the reason for that is because the Russians have been backing President Assad, as they should have done and can do under international law. Assad has invited them in. And so this is actually a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And it's absolutely laughable to see the Western politicians, many of them, saying that Russia is the aggressor. Of course, they're not. The opposite is true. It's the British and the Americans that are putting troops into the Baltic states threatening Russia.
All right, let's leave it there for now. That's Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us via Skype from Bristol. Mr. Gosling, thank you very much indeed for that analysis there.